There are voices in country music that make people smile and sing along, and then there are voices that make an entire room fall silent. Keith Whitley's voice belonged to the second kind. It was the kind of voice that never needed to show off. It didn't rely on dramatic high notes or loud, dazzling performances. All it took was the first few lines, and people could already feel the deep, unmistakable sadness within it. In the late 1980s, when country music was gradually becoming more polished and commercial, Keith Whitley appeared as something entirely different. He sang slow, deeply emotional ballads with a sincerity that had become increasingly rare. Songs like "Don't Close Your Eyes" and "When You Say Nothing at All" quickly became major hits. Many believed that Nashville had just discovered one of the greatest country voices of a new generation. But behind that success was a far more complicated story. A young man from the mountains of Kentucky, raised on bluegrass music, carrying within him a rare gift, yet also carrying private battles that very few people outside could truly see. And only a few years after Nashville began to recognize his true brilliance, that story would come to an end in a way that left the entire country music world stunned. Because sometimes, the saddest voices are not merely singing about pain, and they are living inside it. This is the story of the life, the career, and the tragedy of Keith Whitley, a voice many believe the world lost far too soon. Long before Nashville knew the name Keith Whitley, before the charts, before the bright lights of the stage, his story began in a place far removed from the center of American music. He was born on July 1st, 1954, in Ashland, Kentucky, but grew up in the small town of Sandy Hook, Kentucky, a quiet community tucked deep within the Appalachian Mountains. Life there moved slowly. Dirt roads curved along the mountainsides. Wooden houses stood scattered among thick forests. And on many weekend evenings, neighbors and family members would gather together, bringing along guitars, banjos, and mandolins to play the traditional sounds of bluegrass music. In Appalachia, music was not something learned in a classroom. It was passed down from one generation to the next. Through family gatherings, through church singing, through long nights when people sat together and shared songs around the sound of a single instrument. It was in this world that Keith Whitley first learned how to sing, not because he dreamed of becoming a star, but simply because music was a natural part of everyday life. As a boy, he often played music with a close friend, another young musician from Kentucky named Ricky Skaggs. The two boys spent countless hours together, listening to bluegrass records, learning traditional melodies, and trying to play them on old, well-worn instruments. At the time, neither of them could have imagined that years later they would both become major figures in American country music. Yet even in those early days, there was something about Keith that stood apart. He didn't just sing the notes correctly, he sang as if every song were a real story. Perhaps it was the Appalachian Mountains, the simple lives of a small town, and the sorrowful stories woven into so many bluegrass songs that taught him how to pour genuine feeling into every line he sang. And one day, that quiet talent would carry the young man far beyond Kentucky, toward a place every country singer dreams of reaching: Nashville. For many country artists, the road to Nashville often begins with talent contests or demo recordings. But for Keith Whitley, that road began in a far more traditional way, through bluegrass music. At a very young age, Keith's talent caught the attention of bluegrass legend Ralph Stanley. Stanley was then leading the famous band the Clinch Mountain Boys, one of the most important bluegrass groups in Appalachia. And in the young man from Kentucky, he recognized something rare. a voice that carried a natural sadness, the kind of feeling that cannot be taught in any music school. Keith soon joined the band. Life as a bluegrass musician was far from glamorous. There were no massive stadiums, no spectacular stage productions. Instead, there were long drives through small towns, simple wooden stages, and audiences who loved traditional music with all their hearts. Yet it was in those humble places that Keith Whitley learned some of the most important lessons of his career. He learned how to tell stories through his voice. He learned how to keep every line simple, yet deeply sincere. And most importantly, he learned how to let emotion guide the music. During those years, Keith also continued playing music with his old friend, Ricky Skaggs. The two young men from Kentucky gradually became familiar names within the bluegrass community. But while Ricky Skaggs would later find his place quickly within the world of traditional country music, Keith Whitley's path would prove far more complicated, because Nashville itself was changing. Country music was becoming more commercial, more polished, and increasingly closer to pop. But Keith still carried the spirit of the Appalachian Mountains within him. His voice was too real, too sorrowful, too traditional. And that led many people within the industry to wonder, did a voice like that still have a place in the modern Nashville sound? Keith Whitley did not yet know the answer. But before long, he would leave the familiar world of bluegrass behind and step into a city where every musical dream would be tested. That city was Nashville. For many country artists, Nashville is the place where dreams come true. But for Keith Whitley, the city was first and foremost a place of waiting. When he left the world of bluegrass and stepped into Nashville, Keith carried with him a remarkable voice, deep, sorrowful, and filled with emotion. Yet in the early 1980s, the country music industry was changing rapidly. The records dominating the airwaves at the time were polished, radio-friendly, and increasingly influenced by pop. Meanwhile, Keith's voice carried the spirit of classic Appalachia, slow, honest, and at times almost too sad for commercial radio. During his early years in Nashville, he took on all kinds of work within the music industry, recording demo tracks, singing background vocals in studio sessions, waiting for a real opportunity. Eventually, Keith signed a contract with RCA Records. For any young singer, this was a significant breakthrough. But success did not arrive right away. His first album failed to make much of an impact. Some of its singles did not even reach high positions on the charts. In an industry that constantly demands quick results, that was enough to make many people begin to doubt. Perhaps Keith Whitley belonged only in bluegrass. Perhaps his voice was simply too traditional to become a modern country star. But those who had heard Keith sing live believed something very different. And they said there was something rare in his voice, a sincerity that very few singers could truly deliver. And just a few years later, when Nashville was almost ready to overlook the name Keith Whitley entirely, an album would appear. An album that would not only change the course of his career, but would make the entire country music industry stop and listen. That album was called Don't Close Your Eyes. When the album Don't Close Your Eyes was released in 1988, not many people in Nashville believed it would change anything. There was no massive promotional campaign, no glamorous image, just a singer with a deeply sorrowful voice, the very kind the country music industry had once considered too traditional to succeed. But then, radio stations began playing a song, Don't Close Your Eyes. From the very first lines, listeners sensed that something was different. Though Keith Whitley didn't sing like a star trying to impress an audience. He sang like a man quietly telling a very real story. His voice didn't try to conquer the listener, it simply made them stop and listen. And then something unexpected began to happen. The song slowly climbed the country charts, week after week, until it finally reached the #1 position. But that was only the beginning. Soon after, another song began appearing on the radio, "When You Say Nothing at All." A love song so gentle it almost felt like a whisper. And yet it was precisely that simplicity that turned the song into one of the most beloved country tracks of its time. Then came a third song, "I'm No Stranger to the Rain," a song about learning how to stand strong through the storms of life. 3 songs in a row, 3 #1 hits on the country charts. Within a single year, Keith Whitley, once considered too traditional, had become one of the most talked about voices in Nashville. But what surprised many people in the industry most was not the chart numbers. It was the way audiences responded to his voice. People often said that when Keith Whitley sang, you didn't just hear a melody, you heard an entire life inside it. And that was why many believed Nashville had just discovered one of the most extraordinary country voices of his generation. But just as his career was finally entering its brightest moment, another battle in Keith Whitley's life was quietly becoming more dangerous than ever before. During the years when Keith Whitley's career was finally beginning to shine, his personal life was also entering a new chapter. That chapter began when he met Lorrie Morgan. In Nashville, Lorrie Morgan was not an unfamiliar face. She was the daughter of country legend George Morgan, a name long respected within the country music community. The two met through performances and music events around Nashville. Their relationship developed quickly, almost naturally, perhaps because both of them understood the life of musicians in the industry so well. They married in 1986. To many people in Nashville, Keith and Lorrie represented one of country music's most hopeful couples. One possessed what many called the most sincere voice of the new generation. The other was a young, talented female singer with a wide future ahead of her. When Keith Whitley stepped onto the stage to sing his sorrowful ballads, Lorrie Morgan was often standing just behind the curtain, listening to every line. Many people believed that Lorrie was one of the rare sources of peace in Keith's life. But the life of an artist is never defined only by the stage lights. Behind the deeply emotional songs, Keith Whitley was still fighting a battle he had carried with him for many years, a battle with alcohol. In the bluegrass world where he had grown up, drinking was often seen as a natural part of life after performances. But over time, the habit had become something far more difficult to control. Friends and family, including Lorrie Morgan, tried many times to help Keith overcome the problem. There were moments when he tried to change, and there were periods when it seemed things were getting better. But the pressures of a rising career, long tours, and the relentless demands of life in the entertainment industry always seemed to bring the struggle back again. And the heartbreaking truth was that just as Nashville was beginning to recognize Keith Whitley as a true star, his personal battle was quietly moving toward a point that no one could stop. To the audience, Keith Whitley seemed to be living through the most beautiful years of his career. His songs were reaching the top of the charts. Country radio played his music every day, and his name was beginning to appear in nearly every conversation about Nashville's great voices. But behind the stage lights, Keith's life was far more complicated. The battle with alcohol, something that had followed him since his early bluegrass days, had never truly disappeared. And in many traditional music communities, especially in Appalachia, drinking was often seen as part of life after long performances. But for Keith, that habit slowly grew into something much harder to control. There were times when he tried to change. Friends in the industry and his family, especially Lorrie Morgan, encouraged him many times to seek help and overcome his drinking. There were periods when he genuinely tried. But fame brought a different kind of pressure. Endless tours, long nights on stage, and the growing feeling that more and more people expected something from him. For someone as emotionally sensitive as Keith Whitley, those pressures were not always easy to carry. What many people later remembered most was the contrast within him. On stage, Keith sang with a calm sincerity that made audiences believe he had everything under control. But away from the stage, he was sometimes a man trying to keep his balance in the middle of his own life. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth was that many of his most famous songs seemed to reflect exactly what he was going through. When Keith Whitley sang, "I'm No Stranger to the Rain," he was singing about a man who had grown used to life's storms, a man who learned to stand strong even when everything around him became difficult. The audience heard the song as a moving story, but very few people at the time realized that, for Keith Whitley, it wasn't just a song. It was a part of his life. And before long, Nashville would be forced to face a piece of news that would leave the entire country music world in stunned silence. Because sometimes the storms in a person's life arrive far faster than anyone could ever imagine. The storms in Keith Whitley's life had existed long before Nashville ever knew his name. For many years, he had tried to overcome them. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he did not. But in the spring of 1989, from the outside, it seemed that everything was finally falling into place. To Nashville, Keith Whitley was entering the brightest moment of his career. His songs were still playing on radio stations across America. The album Don't Close Your Eyes had made him one of the most talked about voices in country music. Many people in the industry believed Keith Whitley was only just beginning, but on May 9th, 1989, Nashville woke up to news that left the entire music community in shock. Keith Whitley was found dead at his home in Nashville. The cause was later determined to be acute alcohol poisoning. He was only 33 years old. The news spread quickly across Nashville, and then across the United States. For many people, it felt almost impossible to believe. Just a few months earlier, Keith Whitley had still been standing on stage, singing the kind of ballads that could make an audience fall completely silent. That voice still seemed to echo in the memories of so many listeners. His death left the entire country music world stunned. Because this was not an artist who had already passed his peak. This was a star standing in the very middle of the brightest moment of his career. And what made the loss even more painful was the meaning behind a song Keith had released not long before. "I'm No Stranger to the Rain," a song about learning how to stand strong in the storms of life. After Keith Whitley passed away, the song continued climbing the country charts, eventually reaching #1. And from that moment on, many people began hearing the song in a completely different way. It was no longer just a country ballad. It felt almost like a final message from a voice that had left the world too soon. Nashville lost a remarkable artist. But for many country music fans, the sense of loss was even deeper than that, because they believed the world had just lost a voice that might have become one of the greatest legends the genre had ever known. And the question many people still ask to this day is this: if Keith Whitley had been given more years, would his story have turned out differently? After Keith Whitley passed away, Nashville did not simply lose a singer. It lost a voice that many believed had only just begun telling its story. In the months following his death, country radio stations across the United States began playing Keith Whitley songs more than ever before. Songs such as "Don't Close Your Eyes," "When You Say Nothing at All," I'm No Stranger to the Rain were no longer just chart-topping hits. They became songs that listeners returned to whenever they wanted to hear something truly sincere in country music. What makes Keith Whitley's legacy remarkable is that his influence did not end with the late 1980s. In the years that followed, many famous country artists openly said that his voice had deeply shaped the way they sang and the way they understood music. Among them were artists such as Alan Jackson, Garth Brooks, Vince Gill. All of them acknowledged that Keith Whitley was one of the most genuine country voices they had ever heard, not because of extraordinary vocal technique, but because of emotion. Keith Whitley sang like a man living inside the very story he was telling. Perhaps that is why his songs continue to be heard, even decades after he is gone. In an industry that constantly changes, where new trends appear and disappear again and again, Keith Whitley's voice has held a place that feels almost timeless. Not because he had a long career, not because he released dozens of albums, but because in that brief span of time, he left behind songs that many believe will never grow old. And for Nashville, the story of Keith Whitley will always carry a question that no one can truly answer. If he had been given more years, would the history of country music have been written a little differently? In the end, every stage light will eventually fade. The tours that passed through dozens of cities, the charts that once changed every week, the nights when thousands of fans sang along to a familiar melody, all of it eventually becomes part of memory. But there are some voices that do not disappear when the stage lights go out. Keith Whitley's voice is one of them. He is not remembered because of major scandals, nor because of a career that lasted for decades. Instead, he is remembered for something far simpler: a voice filled with honesty, a way of telling stories through music that made listeners feel as if they were hearing their own lives reflected in the song. Songs like Don't Close Your Eyes and When You Say Nothing at All still echo today on country radio, in Nashville bars, and in the playlists of those who love classic country music. Many years have passed since the day Keith Whitley left this world, but whenever that voice begins to play, people still feel as though he is standing somewhere beneath the stage lights, holding that familiar microphone, singing once more. Perhaps that is what truly makes an artist become a legend, not because they stayed for a long time, but because even after they are gone, their music continues to live in the hearts of those who listen. If Keith Whitley's story reminds you of one of his songs, share that song in the comments below. And if you would like to discover more stories behind the legends of country music, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.